The day began like any other at the Hamilton Mansion, a vast estate that stretched across acres of land, with fountains, trimmed hedges, and colorful gardens that seemed to bloom all year round. The estate was the crown jewel of Richard Hamilton's empire, a billionaire who was known in the city for his iron-fisted business decisions, his lavish parties, and his ability to turn everything he touched into gold. Richard had always taken pride in his surroundings. Every morning, he would walk out onto the balcony of his mansion, sip his black coffee, and admire the beauty that his money had created. The sight of perfectly trimmed roses, marble statues glistening in the sun, and the sound of water cascading through fountains filled him with satisfaction. But on this particular day, something was different. Something would shatter his sense of control, pride, and security in ways he could never have imagined. Richard had finished a meeting earlier than expected. Restless and tired of phone calls and financial reports, he decided to step away from the noise of his business empire. "I'll take a walk through the gardens," he told himself. "Maybe the fresh air will clear my head." The gardens stretched out endlessly, with winding stone paths, rare orchids imported from Asia, and ancient oak trees that had stood tall for centuries. Birds sang sweet melodies as the late afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden glow. It was the kind of scene most people would dream of, but to Richard, it was simply part of his everyday life. As he strolled past the roses, his eyes drifted to the farthest corner of the lawn, where tall hedges grew thicker. Normally, this part of the garden was quiet and hidden from sight. It was where staff often trimmed the plants or gathered fallen branches. Richard rarely paid attention to that side. But that day, something caught his eye. A figure knelt low to the ground, hunched over, moving in a strange way. At first, Richard thought it was one of the gardeners, perhaps fixing something. But as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a gardener. It was Grace, his maid. Grace was an older woman in her late 50s, her back slightly bent from years of hard work. She had worked in his home for almost 5 years, always quiet, always respectful. She wore the simple uniform of the staff, a plain dress and apron, her hair neatly tied back. She was not the type of woman who drew attention to herself. In fact, Richard often forgot she was even there. She moved through his mansion like a shadow, cleaning, organizing, and serving without complaint. But now, Grace looked different. She was kneeling in the grass, her hands shaking slightly. Richard slowed his steps, curiosity growing in his chest. What was she doing? He squinted. At first, he thought maybe she was weeding the garden or picking something off the ground. But then his heart lurched violently in his chest. She wasn't gardening. She was eating the grass. Richard stopped, frozen. His expensive leather shoes sank slightly into the soil, but he didn't notice. His entire body went cold. There was Grace, his maid, plucking blades of grass from the ground, lifting them to her mouth, and chewing them. Her lips moved slowly, her face filled with a mix of shame and desperation. She tore another handful, brushed off the dirt with her trembling fingers, and placed it into her mouth. Chewing as though it was the most natural thing in the world, Richard's first reaction was disbelief. He blinked rapidly, rubbed his eyes, and even shook his head slightly, thinking maybe he was imagining things. But no, it was real. His maid, in the garden of his billion-dollar estate, was eating grass like a starving animal. A wave of emotions surged through him: anger, confusion, and disgust. What on earth is she doing? Has she lost her mind? He whispered under his breath. His natural instinct was anger. His mansion was a symbol of wealth, dignity, and perfection. To see someone, especially one of his staff, reduced to such an act in the middle of his luxurious garden felt like an insult, a disgrace. But before he could speak, something stopped him. Richard's sharp, businesslike gaze softened when he noticed Grace's face more clearly. Her eyes, once calm and humble, were filled with tears. She wasn't eating grass with any joy or madness. She was doing it with shame. Every movement of her hand trembled, as though she feared someone would catch her. Her lips quivered as she chewed, her face pale and drawn, her body thinner than he had remembered. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't insanity. This was desperation. That he stepped closer, the sound of his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Grace's head jerked up suddenly, and her eyes widened in shock. She froze, the half-chewed blades of grass still in her mouth. Her hands trembled violently as she dropped the handful she had been holding, scattering it onto the ground like a guilty child caught stealing. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to fall silent. The birds stopped singing. The fountain's water no longer roared in Richard's ears. There was only the heavy beating of his heart and the sight of Grace's trembling body. Finally, Richard's voice broke the silence. "Grace, what are you doing?" His words were soft, but they carried a weight that made the air thick. Grace's eyes darted downward, unable to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Her face flushed with shame, and she quickly tried to brush away the blades of grass from her apron as if to erase the evidence. "Please, I didn't mean for you to see this." Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. He had expected her to explain, maybe even to deny what he saw. But the way her voice cracked, the way her body shook with fear, told him everything. This wasn't a mistake. She had been doing this because she had no other choice. "Grace," he repeated, stepping even closer, his voice trembling slightly now. "Why are you eating grass?" She shook her head violently, her lips quivering. "Please, sir, please don't fire me," she whispered. I'll work harder. I'll do anything. Just don't take this job away from me." Richard's chest tightened. He was no longer the powerful billionaire in that moment. He was just a man staring at the raw, painful reality of someone else's suffering. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to shout, to ask why she didn't eat the food in the kitchen, why she didn't speak up, why she would do something so humiliating. But as he looked into her tear-streaked face, he realized that the answers might break him. That he stood there, frozen in silence, watching the woman who had served him faithfully for years, reduced to eating grass in his garden. And for the first time in his life, Richard Hamilton, the billionaire who had everything, felt powerless. Richard Hamilton was a man known for his temper. In boardrooms, his voice alone could silence a room. He was the kind of billionaire who built empires not by kindness, but by force, precision, and intimidation. Employees whispered behind his back that his glare was enough to make even seasoned executives stammer "S.O." when he first saw Grace, his maid, chewing grass like a starving animal in his manicured garden. His instincts screamed at him. Anger, his fists tightened at his sides. How dare she, he thought. In my home, on my property, I give her a job, I pay her, and this is what she does? Making a mockery of my household. The billionaire in him, the man who always demanded order and perfection, was ready to explode. He pictured the gossip if anyone ever saw this. Servants whispering, neighbors laughing, newspapers twisting the story into scandalous headlines. Billionaire's maid found eating grass in mansion garden. The image infuriated him. He felt as though his reputation, his dignity, even his empire, were somehow tainted by what he had just witnessed. But then, something shifted. To Richard's gaze locked on Grace's hands. They were trembling, frail, thin, and covered in dirt from pulling grass straight from the ground. He noticed the way her fingers curled, how her nails were cracked and worn down from years of hard labor. These weren't the hands of a careless woman or someone seeking attention. These were the hands of a survivor. And her eyes weren't wild with madness. They were wet with tears. For the first time, Richard saw not just a maid, not just an employee, but a human being. One who looked as though the weight of the entire world pressed down upon her shoulders. His anger softened, just a little. He frowned, his chest tightening with something unfamiliar. He had built skyscrapers, bought luxury yachts, and sealed multi-billion-dollar deals. But in that moment, he couldn't understand the scene before him. Why would anyone, especially someone working under his roof, be forced to such desperation? "Grace," he said finally, his voice steady but stern. "Stop." She froze instantly, like a child caught stealing candy. Her hands, still clinging to blades of grass, dropped them as though they were burning her skin. Her whole body trembled. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Please forgive me." Her reaction wasn't what Richard expected. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't careless. She was terrified. That fear pierced through him like a knife. Why was she so afraid? Why did she think eating grass would cost her everything? Richard stepped closer, his tall shadow falling over her small, kneeling frame. "Why are you eating grass, Grace?" His voice, though calm, carried a weight that demanded truth. But instead of answering, Grace shook her head violently. "Please don't fire me. I'll work harder. I won't do it again. I, I didn't want you to see." Richard's heart clenched. She thought this was about her job. She thought he would throw her out for being hungry. "Grace," he said again, softer this time, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level. "This isn't about your job. I want to understand." "What?" Her lips trembled, but she refused to look at him. Instead, she stared at the grass beneath her, as though it could swallow her whole. Her silence spoke louder than words. And then, Richard realized something. This wasn't a moment of madness. This was survival. He thought back to the times he had passed her in the hallways. Always with a polite smile, always quiet, never asking for anything. He remembered how she sometimes refused to join the staff when meals were served, insisting she had already eaten. He had assumed it was dignity, or perhaps habit. But what if it wasn't? What if she had been hiding her hunger all along? The realization hit him like a storm. Richard Hamilton, a man who wasted thousands of dollars on a single dinner party, had a maid who was so desperate she ate grass behind the hedges of his mansion. He swallowed hard, guilt twisting inside him. But another emotion surfaced too: curiosity. He needed to know the truth. He couldn't turn away now. "Grace," he pressed, his tone firmer but no longer harsh. "Tell me, why are you doing this? What has brought you to this point?" Her eyes flickered up at him for the briefest second, full of shame and sorrow, before darting away again. I, I can't," she whispered. "You wouldn't understand." "Make me understand," Richard said quickly, almost pleading. The words surprised even him. He had never begged anyone for anything in his life. But here he was, desperate for the truth. Grace's hands tightened into fists on her lap, her knuckles white. Her breathing grew shaky, uneven. For a moment, Richard thought she might collapse right there on the grass. Finally, in a voice so small he could barely hear it, she whispered, "Because hunger hurts more than shame." The words punched Richard in the chest. Hunger. That single word shattered the walls of his anger. Hunger was something Richard had never known. As a child, he grew up in comfort, and as a man, he lived in excess. His world had always been filled with banquets, buffets, and feasts. Hunger was a concept he read about in reports, not something real, certainly not something happening under his own roof. "Hunger?" he echoed, almost in disbelief. Grace nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, sir. I, I couldn't bear it anymore. My stomach, it wouldn't stop hurting. I thought if I just chewed something, anything, it would quiet down. That's all." Richard's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. The anger that had first boiled in him was gone, completely gone. In its place was something heavier, something unfamiliar, something that felt like guilt, sorrow, and shame all at once. How could he have not seen this? How could he have missed the signs? He had always prided himself on being sharp, on noticing every detail in business deals and negotiations. But when it came to Grace, someone who had worked faithfully in his home, He had seen nothing, but he felt blind. And in that blindness, Grace had been suffering alone. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of a fountain splashing water and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than he had ever used with anyone before. Grace, I'm not angry. I need to understand. Please, tell me everything. Grace's shoulders shook as she cried silently, covering her face with her hands. She didn't answer right away, but the sight of her vulnerability broke something deep inside Richard Hamilton. The billionaire who thought he was untouchable. The man who had once walked his garden with pride now stood in its corner, humbled, desperate for the truth of a woman he had never really seen until that moment. Richard Hamilton had built his empire on control. Numbers, contracts, strategies, everything in his world followed logic, order, and reason. But as he knelt in the corner of his vast garden, facing Grace, the woman who had worked faithfully in his mansion for years, he realized that life didn't always follow reason. She was crying. Not the dramatic sobs of someone seeking attention, but the quiet, broken kind of crying. The kind that spoke of pain buried deep in the soul. Her frail body shook with each breath, and her wrinkled hands tried to cover her face, as though hiding from the shame of being caught. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. Grace, look at me. She shook her head, whispering, No, sir, please. Don't make me. Grace, he said again, softer this time, almost pleading. I'm not here to punish you. I just want to understand. Tell me why you're doing this. For a long moment, the only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. Richard could feel his own heartbeat pounding in his chest as he waited. Finally, Grace lowered her hands. Her eyes, red and swollen, met his. And in that gaze, Richard saw something he had never seen in anyone before. Raw, unfiltered pain. She drew in a shaky breath and whispered, My children, Richard frowned. Your children? Grace nodded, her voice breaking. They haven't eaten for 2 days. The last bit of food I had, I sent to them. I thought I could manage. I thought maybe I could go without. But last night, the hunger became too much. My stomach, it felt like it was tearing me apart. Her tears spilled freely now, rolling down her cheeks. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. And this morning, when I came to work, I couldn't bear it anymore. So I came here, where no one could see me, and I thought if I could just chew something, anything, it might stop the pain. That's why I ate the grass. Richard froze. The words cut through him like a blade as he stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. Your children, they're starving? Grace nodded. Yes, sir. They're all I have. Their father left long ago. I work here to keep them alive. Every penny I earn goes to them. Rent, school fees, little bits of food. But last week, the rent went up and one of my boys got sick. The medicine was expensive. I paid for it, but it left me with nothing. Nothing for food. Her voice cracked as she covered her face again. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. I thought I could carry this burden quietly. But hunger doesn't let you hide. Richard's chest tightened so painfully he almost couldn't breathe. That he had heard stories about poverty, seen statistics and reports, even donated to charities from time to time. But hearing Grace's words, seeing her frail body trembling before him, made it real in a way numbers never could. This wasn't some distant tragedy. This was happening right here, in his own home. Under his very roof, he remembered her smile when she served his breakfast, the way she quietly tidied the rooms without ever disturbing him, the countless times she greeted him politely, as though everything in her life was fine. And yet behind that humble smile, her children were starving. That Richard's eyes burned with unshed tears. Grace, why didn't you tell me? She shook her head, her voice trembling. Because, sir, I didn't want to be a burden. You already pay me more than I deserve. I thought, If I just worked harder, if I just endured it, things would get better. I never wanted you to see me like this. I never wanted you to know." Her humility broke him. Here he was, a billionaire with more money than he could ever spend, a man who thought nothing of dropping tens of thousands on a bottle of wine or wasting trays of untouched food after a party. And yet Grace, the woman who served in his home every day, had been starving silently, and not just her. Her children, innocent children, going to bed hungry, their mother forced to eat grass just to keep going. Richard's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, tears spilled down his face. He had cried once as a boy when his father died, and once again when his mother passed away. But since then, he had built walls around his heart, walls so high and thick that nothing could break through. Or so he thought. Now, in the corner of his garden, watching Grace tremble in shame, those walls crumbled completely. "Grace," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I never knew. I never even thought." She looked up at him, startled, as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The great Richard Hamilton, the man everyone feared, with tears running down his cheeks. "I've been blind," he admitted, his voice raw. "I built all of this." He gestured around at the sprawling gardens, the fountains, the mansion towering behind them. "And yet I didn't see the suffering right in front of me. I didn't see you." Grace shook her head quickly. "No, sir, please, don't blame yourself. This is my burden. It's not your fault." But her words only made the guilt worse. Richard had prided himself on controlling everything in his empire, on knowing every detail, every risk, every weakness. And yet here was a weakness he had never considered, that the very people who kept his household running could be suffering silently while he lived in excess. The realization gnawed at him, burning in his chest. "Grace," he said firmly, his voice steadier now, "this is not your burden alone. You shouldn't have to starve while working in my home. You shouldn't have to choose between medicine and food for your children. You shouldn't have to eat grass." His words broke something inside her. For the first time, she sobbed openly, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had carried her pain in silence for so long that finally releasing it was overwhelming. Richard reached out without thinking and gently rested a hand on her shoulder. It was an unfamiliar gesture for him. He wasn't the type of man to show affection, but in that moment, it felt right. It felt necessary. "Grace," he said softly, "I promise you, things are going to change." She looked at him through tear-filled eyes, disbelief written across her face. She had worked for the wealthy long enough to know that promises often meant nothing. But something in Richard's tone, something in his eyes, told her he meant it. For the first time since her husband had left, for the first time since hunger had become her family's constant companion, Grace felt a flicker of hope, and Richard, for the first time in his billionaire life, felt something richer than wealth. He felt humanity. Richard Hamilton had always believed that strength came from power, from wealth, from being in control of everything around him. For decades, this belief had driven him to the top of the corporate world. He was feared by competitors, admired by investors, and respected by politicians. To him, success was measured in dollars, in towering skyscrapers, in private jets, and in the way the world bent when he entered a room. But as he knelt on the soft earth of his garden, staring at Grace, the woman who had faithfully polished his floors, cleaned his halls, and quietly served him without complaint, he felt the weight of a truth he had ignored his whole life. Wealth had blinded him. Here was a woman who had scrubbed his marble floors on an empty stomach, who had smiled politely while her children starved at home, who had carried her suffering in silence just to keep her dignity intact. And he, Richard Hamilton, the billionaire, had never noticed. The shame burned inside him. He thought about the extravagant parties he had thrown, where tables overflowed with food that often ended up in the trash. He remembered the 10-course dinners he barely touched, the wine bottles worth more than most people's monthly rent, the way he had dismissed leftovers as insignificant, And then, in sharp contrast, he thought of Grace. A mother so desperate that she had eaten grass, to survive, because every last penny she earned went to feed her children. The image tore at him. For years, Richard had lived in his fortress of luxury, believing he was untouchable, believing he understood the world. But in that moment, he realized he had understood nothing. He had seen business, power, and money, but he had not seen people. His throat tightened as he whispered, almost to himself, "I've been blind." Grace looked at him with confusion, still wiping tears from her face. "Sir." Richard turned his gaze toward the mansion that loomed behind them. Its shining glass windows reflected the sunlight, a symbol of everything he had built. But instead of pride, all he felt now was emptiness. "What good is all of this?" he said softly, gesturing to the mansion, the gardens, the wealth that surrounded them. "If the people closest to me are suffering, what good is money if it blinds you to the pain in your own home?" Grace shook her head quickly, trying to defend him. "Please, sir, don't blame yourself. You've given me work, and for that I am grateful. I never expected more." Her humility broke him further. She wasn't asking for sympathy or pity or even help. She was simply explaining, as though enduring hunger and pain was something natural, something she was destined for. Richard's heart ached. He had spent his life fighting for bigger profits, better deals, and higher returns. Yet here was a woman who had been fighting for something far more basic, survival, and she had done it quietly, with dignity. He remembered her words, "Because hunger hurts more than shame." The phrase echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. He had known shame before, when he lost business deals, when rivals mocked him, when newspapers criticized his methods. But he had never known hunger. He had never felt the gnawing emptiness that forced a person to eat grass just to trick the body into silence. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, tears slipped freely down his face. He didn't care if Grace saw. He didn't care if the entire world saw. In that moment, he was not the billionaire Richard Hamilton. He was just a man confronted by the brutal truth of another's suffering. "Grace," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She lowered her gaze. "Because, sir, I didn't want you to think I was ungrateful. You already pay me. You give me more than many others would. I didn't want to ask for more. I didn't want to be a burden." Those words pierced his soul. A burden. How many others like Grace had lived in silence because they feared being a burden? How many people had suffered right under his nose while he remained blind to their struggles? He thought of the chauffeurs, the gardeners, the cooks, the cleaners, all the people who made his life seamless and comfortable. Did he truly know their lives? Did he know what they sacrificed, what they endured? Or had he, in his arrogance, reduced them to shadows in his mansion, tools in his machine of wealth? The realization was devastating. For so long, Richard had seen himself as powerful. But true power, he now realized, wasn't about controlling others or amassing wealth. True power was about responsibility, about seeing, about choosing to act when others turned away. And he had failed, but he would not fail again. Slowly, he stood, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the grass. He looked down at Grace, still kneeling, her face streaked with tears. Gently, he extended his hand to her. She hesitated, unsure if she should take it. But Richard's eyes, usually cold and distant, were filled with something she had never seen before: compassion. "Please," he said softly, "stand with me." With trembling fingers, Grace took his hand. He helped her rise, her frail body shaking as though the weight of the world still clung to her shoulders. For a moment, they stood together in silence. The billionaire and the maid, two people from different worlds, united by a truth that had stripped away all barriers. Richard looked at her, his voice firm now, filled with resolve. "Grace, I promise you, this will never happen again. Not to you, not to your children, not to anyone who works under my roof. I swear it." Grace's lips parted in surprise. She searched his face, trying to see if he truly meant it. And what she saw there, tears, sincerity, and unshakable determination, told her he did. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. As Richard walked her back toward the mansion, his mind raced. He thought of all the changes he needed to make, not just for Grace, but for everyone who served him. No one in his household would ever go hungry again. No one would ever suffer in silence. But it was more than that. This wasn't just about his staff. This was about himself. For decades, Richard Hamilton had lived for wealth. But now, for the first time, he realized that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to heal, to protect, to uplift. The billionaire who once measured success in dollars now measured it in tears wiped away, in stomachs filled, in lives restored. That afternoon, in the quiet of his garden, Richard Hamilton was reborn. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was a man awakening to humanity. Richard Hamilton had built his life on decisive action. Once he set his mind on something, he moved mountains to make it happen. That drive had made him a billionaire. But for the first time in his life, the action he felt compelled to take wasn't about money, business, or power. It was about humanity. That night, after his discovery in the garden, Richard could not rest. His mind replayed the haunting image of Grace kneeling in the dirt, chewing grass to quiet her hunger. It struck him harder than any financial loss, harder than any business rivalry. It wasn't just a memory. It was a wound carved into his heart. He walked the halls of his mansion in silence, the marble floors echoing with every step. The paintings, chandeliers, and gold accents that once filled him with pride now seemed empty. What was the point of luxury when the people who served within these walls were suffering? Finally, Richard entered the grand kitchen. Normally, this space was bustling with chefs preparing gourmet meals. Tonight, however, it was silent. Only a few dim lights illuminated the polished counters and gleaming appliances. Richard hesitated. It had been years since he had cooked anything himself. He was a man used to being served. Yet tonight, something inside him urged otherwise. He rolled up his sleeves, opened the refrigerator, and began pulling out food. Eggs, bread, vegetables, cheese. Simple things, but enough to create a warm meal. His hands fumbled at first. He hadn't cracked an egg in decades, but soon he found a rhythm. The sizzle of butter in a pan, the smell of garlic frying, the steam of boiling vegetables. It grounded him, humbled him. When the meal was ready, Richard plated it carefully. Nothing extravagant, nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs, sautéed vegetables, and toasted bread. Food meant to fill. To comfort, he carried the plate himself, walking quietly down the hall to the small room where Grace stayed when working overnight. He knocked softly. There was silence. Then a hesitant voice. "Yes, sir?" "Grace, it's me. May I come in?" The door opened slowly, revealing Grace's weary face. She looked surprised, shocked, even, to see Richard standing there with a plate of food in his hands. I made this for you," Richard said awkwardly, his voice low. Grace's eyes widened. "You cooked this?" He nodded. "Yes. Please, eat." Tears welled in her eyes again as she accepted the plate. Her hands trembled as she sat down on the edge of her bed and took the first bite. The moment the warm food touched her lips, her body shook with relief. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, tears streaming down her cheeks. Richard watched silently, his chest tightening with every movement of her fork. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was a woman's body being restored, one bite at a time. For the first time in decades, Richard felt something deeper than pride or power. He felt purpose. When Grace finished, she whispered, "Thank you, sir." I don't know what to say." Richard shook his head. "Don't thank me, Grace. I should be thanking you. You've opened my eyes to something I should have seen long ago." Grace looked at him in confusion, but Richard didn't explain further. He wasn't ready yet. The storm inside him was still unfolding. That night, Richard hardly slept. Instead, he began to plan, not for a business deal, but for a transformation. The next morning by sunrise, Richard had already called a meeting with his top advisors and staff. They gathered in his study, puzzled by the urgency in his voice. His assistant asked, "Sir, is there an emergency with the company?" "Yes," Richard replied firmly, "but not the kind you think." He stood before them, his hands clasped tightly. "Yesterday, I saw something that changed me. One of my employees, someone who has given years of her life in service, was starving in my own home. Her children were starving, and I was too blind, too consumed with my wealth, to notice." The room was silent. His advisors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. Richard's voice grew stronger. "From this day forward, no one who works under me will ever go hungry again. No staff member, no gardener, no maid, no driver. I want a monthly allowance for every employee's family, enough to cover food, healthcare, and education. Draft the papers immediately." One of his advisors stammered, "Sir, that will cost millions." "Do it," Richard interrupted sharply. "And if anyone here thinks this is a waste of money, you're free to leave my house right now. I've wasted more than that on champagne at a single party. I will not waste lives." The firmness in his tone silenced all objections. For once, his advisors weren't looking at the ruthless businessman they had always known. They were looking at a man who had found something greater than profit. Later that week, Richard asked Grace to accompany him to her home. She was hesitant, embarrassed to let her employer see where she lived, but Richard insisted. When they arrived, Richard was struck by the stark contrast between his mansion and her tiny, worn-down apartment building. The paint was peeling, the hallways dim, and the air heavy with the smell of poverty. Inside, Grace's children looked up in shock as their mother entered with the billionaire. They were thin, their clothes old and patched, but their eyes, wide with both fear and curiosity, shone brightly. Richard's heart broke as he saw them. These were the children she had starved herself to feed. These were the lives she had fought for. Even if it meant chewing grass to survive, he knelt down to their level, smiling gently. "Hello, I'm a friend of your mother's." The children glanced at Grace, who nodded, encouraging them to trust him. Slowly, they smiled back. Richard reached into the bag he had brought and began unloading groceries, fresh fruits, vegetables, milk, bread, rice, and more. The children's eyes widened with excitement, their little hands reaching out eagerly. "From now on," Richard said softly, looking at Grace, "your children will never go to bed hungry again." Grace's knees buckled, and she sat down heavily, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Richard placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to say anything. Just know, you are not alone anymore." Richard's actions didn't stop there. Word spread quickly among his employees that their billionaire employer had changed. For years, Richard Hamilton had been known as strict, demanding, even cold. But now, he was different. Groceries were delivered weekly to every staff member's family. Health insurance was extended to all employees. Education funds were set aside for their children. For the first time, the people who worked for him felt not like servants, but like family. And Richard himself felt something he had never felt in all his years of wealth: joy. Real joy. It wasn't the kind of joy that came from buying another mansion or closing a billion-dollar deal. It was the joy of seeing Grace's children eat until their bellies were full, of hearing laughter where once there had been silence, of knowing his wealth was finally serving a purpose greater than himself. That night, as Richard stood once more in his garden, he looked at the spot where he had first seen Grace eating grass. The memory still haunted him, but now it carried a different meaning. It wasn't just a picture of shame. It was the moment that awakened his soul. That he whispered into the evening air, "Thank you, Grace, for saving me." Because in truth, While Richard had saved Grace and her children from hunger, she had saved him from something far worse, a life of blindness, emptiness, and wasted wealth. The garden was quiet that night, bathed in soft moonlight. Richard Hamilton stood at the very spot where, days earlier, he had witnessed something that shattered his world and rebuilt his heart. He remembered Grace on her knees, chewing grass to fight her hunger. The image, once unbearable, had now become sacred, a reminder of the moment his life truly began. But what Richard did not yet realize was that his personal awakening would ripple far beyond the walls of his mansion. The quiet beginning of change at first, the changes Richard made in his household seemed small. Groceries were delivered regularly to all his staff, healthcare plans extended to their families, and wages increased. Grace's children began attending school with full stomachs and new books. The drivers, gardeners, and maids, all of whom had once felt invisible, were treated with dignity and care. But people noticed. Neighbors whispered when they saw trucks unloading crates of food at the homes of Richard's employees. Other wealthy families in the city, long accustomed to living in insulated luxury, began to ask questions. Why was the infamous Hamilton, known for his ruthlessness in business, suddenly pouring resources into the lives of his workers? Some dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Others speculated it was guilt. But when a journalist finally uncovered the truth, the story of the billionaire who found his maid eating grass, the world could no longer look away. The story spreads. The article was raw, emotional, and heartbreaking. It described Grace's silent suffering, her children's hunger, and the shocking image of a woman forced to eat grass to survive. But it also told of Richard's tears, his decision to transform, and the new policies he had enacted. The story went viral almost overnight. News outlets picked it up. Social media flooded with the headline, "Billionaire finds maid eating grass. Her story changes his life forever." Comments poured in from across the world. "This broke me. How could anyone let it get this far? This billionaire gave me hope that even the rich can have a heart." And most importantly, how many Graces are there in the world right now? The story was no longer just about one billionaire and his maid. It became a mirror held up to society, forcing people everywhere to confront the silent struggles of those they overlooked. For weeks, Grace remained quiet, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She had lived her life in the shadows, invisible to the world. Now, people wanted to hear her voice. At first, she was hesitant. She told Richard, "I am not educated enough to speak. I am just a maid." But Richard gently corrected her. "Grace, you are not just a maid. You are a mother who sacrificed everything for her children. You are stronger than any of us. People need to hear your truth." And so, Grace agreed. Her first public interview was simple. She spoke softly, her words carrying the weight of her experience. She didn't accuse, didn't blame, didn't demand. She only told the truth about hunger, about dignity, about how she chose shame over watching her children starve. Millions listened. Many wept. Some said her story changed how they treated their own employees, neighbors, and even strangers on the street. Grace's quiet courage, once hidden in silence, had become a voice that touched the world. For Richard, the transformation did not stop with Grace. The more he saw the impact of her story, the more he realized that he had been given a responsibility larger than himself. He established a foundation in Grace's name, the Grace Foundation, dedicated to fighting hunger among domestic workers and low-income families. He poured millions into it, but more importantly, he used his influence to draw other billionaires, corporations, and leaders into the cause. What began as a personal vow soon became a movement. Workshops were set up to train domestic workers in financial literacy. Schools were built for their children. Food programs expanded across the city. And everywhere he went, Richard made sure to credit Grace. "This isn't my story," he told an audience at a charity gala. "This is Grace's story. A woman who taught me that true wealth is not measured in what you own, but in how many lives you touch. The applause was thunderous. Months later, Grace's children stood proudly on a stage, receiving scholarships from the very foundation that bore their mother's name. The little girl who once went to bed hungry now dreamed of becoming a doctor. The boy who used to wear tattered shoes now wanted to be an engineer. And Grace? She stood beside Richard, not as a maid, but as a partner in a mission. "I once thought I was invisible," she said to the crowd, her voice trembling yet strong. "But I have learned that even the smallest voice can be heard if it speaks from the heart. I thank Mr. Hamilton not because he saved me, but because he chose to see me. And when one person truly sees another, miracles can happen." The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Richard wiped a tear from his eye. For years, he had been celebrated for his business deals, but no applause had ever meant more than this. Over time, Richard's transformation and Grace's story became the subject of books, documentaries, and speeches. Universities invited them to talk about compassion in leadership. Charities worldwide drew inspiration from their unlikely partnership, and yet, Richard never let the focus drift away from the true message. Whenever people praised him, he redirected the honor. "Don't look at me," he would say. "Look at Grace. She carried the pain of millions in silence. She represents the people you don't see, the maids, the cleaners, the workers who make your life easier while they struggle to survive. Don't just admire her. Learn from her. Change because of her." In his later years, when people asked Richard what the greatest achievement of his life was, he didn't mention the skyscrapers he built or the billions he earned. He always gave the same answer. "The greatest thing I ever did was listen to a hungry woman's silence." Years passed, but the bond between Richard and Grace remained unshakable. He became like a grandfather to her children, guiding them through life. And she became, in many ways, the family he never had. One evening, long after the world had quieted down from the storm of attention, Richard and Grace sat together in the same garden where it all began. The air was cool, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Grace looked at him and smiled. "Do you ever regret it, sir?" That moment, Richard shook his head, his eyes misty. "No, Grace. It was the greatest blessing of my life. Because that day, I thought I was seeing you at your lowest. But in truth, I was seeing myself. I was the one in poverty, poverty of heart. You gave me back my humanity." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She reached over and squeezed his hand gently. And under the starlit sky, in the quiet of the garden, two souls, once separated by wealth and class, sat as equals, bound by a story that had changed not just them, but the world. The story of the billionaire and the maid lived on long after both had left the earth. Parents told it to their children. Teachers shared it with their students. Leaders reflected on it when making decisions, because the lesson was universal. That wealth without compassion is poverty. That silence can carry the loudest cries. That every human being, no matter their position, deserves to be seen. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, sometimes the most powerful transformations do not begin in boardrooms or governments, but in the quietest corners of life, in a garden, where one soul finally sees another.